I was coming up to do the dishes. I'm just making a YouTube video real quick. What?
I think you need to get done.
Okay, I'll get the dishes done. Okay. Alright. Thanks for watching.
Well, hey there, it's me, Jub, from Radio Free Innsmouth, with episode 264 of the same program, with a little PSA, public service announcement for you, informing you that you should be listening to Reek of the Onsen Gas Fumes, a band that I covered way back in episode 120, because not only are they one of the best and most original sounding, currently active death metal, black metal, grindcore, whatever the fuck metal type
That's barf, barf, puke, whatever
band's going, but you can also learn a lot from them. It opens up a lot of doors into other parts of the scene. One way they do this is with their penchant for selecting very interesting songs to cover. One such instance of this is on their 2017 split with the great Korean black metal band Thy Sepulchral Moon, where they cover the Carcass song Rock the Vote. Of course, they had changed it to Attack the Vote because...
See Kyle.
And they do a really good job of reinterpreting this old song in their rather idiosyncratic style. But the fact that they're covering a Carcass song off of the much maligned Swan Song album is very interesting. Back on episode 122 of this program, I actually dedicated about 20 minutes to defending the Swan Song album because I think it's great and it's really interesting and bands could take a lot of stuff from it, despite it being something of an abrupt stylistic change for Carcass. And apparently, Reek of the Onsen Gas Fumes agreed, and I do love me some confirmation bias.
Oh my dog, what's up?
Similarly, on their Carnage and Extermination Nuclear Energy as a Countermeasure Against Humanity album, they covered the lymphatic phlegm song, Necrosis, of a rather extensive part of the Jejunum Ilium. And that really got my gears turning, and it made me realize that there's not a lot of difference between a lymphatic phlegm song goes something like... and a Reek of the Onsen Gas Fumes doing a little something like... You can hear how the latter builds on the sonic template established by the former band in this instance. And I find that really interesting, a Natsock black metal band being heavily influenced by one of the strangest and most original gore grind bands of all time. Like, if you thought gore grind was all Carcass knockoffs, Lymphatic Phlegm is really gonna kick your ass. I should probably do an episode on them at some point. The third reason you should listen to Reek of the Onsen Gas Fumes is they do split releases with a lot of interesting bands, particularly other members of the circle of the 4,444th Reich, like Grizzly Fetish, or whatever project everybody's favorite grim and frostbitten black metal Korean Moon Sang-ho happens to be running at the time. Should probably do an episode on all his bands too. But perhaps the coolest band that Reek of the Onsen Gas Fumes ever introduced to me through doing these splits is the band that we'll be covering on this week's episode of Radio Free Innsmouth, that being Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle from Brazil. You hear that band name and you're thinking that's definitely a reference to Immortals.
Black and mighty Ravendark.
And Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle's logo would seem to bear that comparison out. It's very Christoph Spidel looking majestic lettering. It's got a nice spiky battle axe in it. But then you look at it a little bit more closely, you see that there's like a machine gun in the middle of it. And whilst the Ravendark part is very, Emperor looking, the Monarchal Canticle part is like way messier and more kind of 80s looking. You're thinking, what is this, like some kind of war metal thing? I see these guys wearing gas masks, bullet belts, and spiked bracelets. Just what the hell kind of music do these guys play? Is it some sort of epic, majestic black metal, or is it some sort of necrotic, dirty, chaotic 80s black metal stuff? And the answer to that is yes.
너는 산이야 바다야?
What I mean by that is they kind of do both. They're sort of like Reek of the Onsen Gas Fumes in a way, where they take a lot of diverse old school influences and do something rather new and interesting with them. Nobody really sounds like Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle, just like nobody really sounds like Reek of the Onsen Gas Fumes. Coupled with their similar ideological proclivities,
See Kyle.
it makes sense that they would do a split album together. That majestic component of their sound really comes forward during the slower sections and the intros. Also, these fucking vocals. I love them. They're great. Probably my favorite currently active black metal vocalist, all things considered. Full stop. In terms of their songwriting, these guys live up to the rather heterodox nature of their logo, building these incredibly epic, multifaceted song structures out of very primitive 80s black metal elements. The guitar playing in particular is notable for being very chaotic, with this constant usage of very fast hammer-on pull-offs. It's very loose and primitive sounding, but at the same time, it's not really sloppy at all. It sounds sloppy at first, but then you realize it hits the notes the same way every time, which indicates to me that the primitivism is a conscious choice as opposed to a byproduct of poor musicianship. Speaking of sounding loose and primitive without actually being sloppy, this thrash break epitomizes that approach to music. You have these slightly overlapping guitar phrases overlaid on top of very reverbed out drums, and it results in this lumbering beast of a thrash break that takes us back into the intro riff. Some of the more astute listeners in the audience might have recognized from whence these 80s black metal influences came in regards to Ravendark's very much against the grain sort of black metal sound. But if you haven't picked up on it yet, remember that fast riff you just heard? Well, here's another Brazilian band, this time one from the 80s, name of Sarcófago. And you could definitely see how those style of 80s riffs influenced Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle quite a bit. Similarly, that thrash break we just heard in the Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle song appears to be highly influenced by similar riffs from the Sarcófago drummer's second band, Sex Trash. Even that epic opening riff seems to be a refinement of some of the weirder riffing styles coming out of the 80s black thrash and death metal scene in Brazil. In this case, Sepultura's got one goes like... Very morbid, intense, sort of ambient riffing that Ravendark then takes and emphasizes the more majestic elements of to create their own sound. I mean, even Ravendark's vocals that I love so much bear a lot in common with the sort of vocals you'd hear from an 80s Brazilian band, going back to Sepultura. So a plethora of other bands have attempted to modernize the Brazilian 1980s black thrash death sort of sound. For my money, prior to the advent of Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle, the bands that had seen the most success in this arena would be some of the Brazilian death metal bands like Crisian, or even more notably Abhorrence, the Brazilian one, not the Finnish one. Although I like the Finnish one too. These guys put out one album in the early 2000s, and man, does it ever kick ass. They've taken that hyper-chaotic riffing style of the 80s Brazilian black thrash death bands and modernized it with a dose of death metal technicality. Perhaps somewhat comparable in Angel Corpse's sound, but what really makes this band stick out for me is how that riffing character always remains redolent of the 80s Brazilian stuff, even in its most technical passages. As far as other bands bringing that 80s Brazilian style forward, a lot of people will first think of like a lot of the war metal bands, which it's not really a style I care for outside of a lot of the foundational bands like Blasphemy, Impaled Nazarene, or Beharit, or some of the later bands that kind of took that sound in a really weird direction, like Sacramentary Abolishment. Some people would even classify Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle as a war metal band, and if that's the case, they're by far my favorite exponent of that particular style. But what really makes makes Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle cool is that they are a nationalist band going back to the roots of metal music in their country. It'd be like if you had a nationalist band from the United States that made a new nationalist interpretation of bands like Deicide or Nunslaughter. You know, it's interesting. And not only do Ravendark take this sort of nationalist interpretation of their country's musical heritage, they were actually spawned out of the rumblings of right-wing black metal in Brazil in the 90s, specifically the band Evil, who initially started out sounding something like, if you were to take the songwriting and aesthetics of a band like Ildjarn and then apply them to the music of a band like Absurd. If you can't tell, this music is not for everybody. It's some of the rawest shit out there. But I think it has an interesting sort of energy to it with the combination of those very punk-influenced drums and the almost rock against communism hymn-like character of the guitar melodies. But towards the end of Evil's career, they went through something of a style change. And began incorporating a whole lot more Nordic black metal influence to the point where a lot of their music sounds a whole lot like stuff Bilskirnir would do later on, with its wandering, punkish melodies over very Burzum-style drumming, and overall much more of an emphasis on ambiance and atmosphere. Also, the production got a lot better, as you're hearing. But in this era of Evil, they got a new drummer, and after Evil broke up, that guy went on to become the drummer and vocalist for Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle, who also have covered several Evil songs over the course of their career, and did a split album with the successor band to Evil, that being Volsung. Basically what I'm getting at is these guys are indelibly tied to the history of black metal in their country. I mean, even their stated ideological stance of,
you know what's amazing? Hitler is the best,
can be seen as stemming from the 80s Brazilian underground with bands like Holocausto and very early on Sepultura. In the case of bands like those, it was clearly more done for shock value, whereas Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle are obviously taking a much more serious philosophical approach to the same subject matter. I'd say that's in keeping with their general tradition of refining and updating old 80s Brazilian black thrash tropes. They also do incorporate a decent amount of Nordic black metal influence, specifically from Bathory, but unlike Evil, who sort of brought those influences in towards the end of their career, this is more noticeable on the earlier work from Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle, which tended to have a foggier sort of sound in terms of how the guitars were mixed, as opposed to the thick, bassy, thrashy tones of their later material. A lot of it actually sounds pretty close to the later Evil albums, which makes sense because this would have been right around when Ravendark Monarchal's Canticle's drummer was getting out of being in the band Evil. Very Nordic sounding riff set here, which might be part of why I enjoy Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle over other war metal bands who tend to have a rather anti-Scandinavian bias to their music, to the point where it becomes rather overdone and cringeworthy.
that was pretty cringe, Jay.
Fuck you, Barack.
Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle had no such hang-ups, fully incorporating Scandinavian black metal into their sound in addition to all of the 80s Brazilian stuff, even during the thrash riffs in a very interesting way. Like right here we have a thrash break that uses Nordic-style black metal bar chords to kind of expand the guitar sound a bit. It kind of reminds me of Zemiel a little bit, and actually Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle end up covering a Zemiel song on one of their demo tapes. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to track it down and hear that one yet.
God damn it!
Speaking of Bathory influence, Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle also apply their own particular aesthetic idiom to the Viking metal era of Bathory's albums like Twilight of the Gods and Hammerheart, taking those very solemn sort of doom metal pieces and infusing them with a militaristic marching sort of energy that I find does a lot to break up the flow of their otherwise very fast and frantic albums. Also really like the weird folky elements going on in the background, like whatever that weird ringing guitar sound going on in the background is. Very atmospheric stuff. And honestly, that's another reason why I tend to enjoy Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle over a lot of other war metal bands. They have way more variety to their sound. But don't worry, they don't get too corny with this kind of stuff. Most of their music is still incredibly fast, chaotic, and influenced by the 80s Brazilian thrash stuff. And it also tends to be more towards the evil end of the spectrum. Again, pulling from that old South American stuff, a lot of which actually ended up influencing the Nordic bands. Hence the fact that when they decide to integrate some more Nordic sounding black metal into the South American stuff, it's not very jarring at all. Like this riff set right here could have happened on a Dark Throne album as easily as it could have happened on a Sex Trash album. And it also gives them a chance to show off their really architectonic method of songwriting, where they might simplify the drum beat and drop out one of the guitar layers in order to let you know that a major change in the song is imminent. This thrash riff absolutely kicks ass and destroys worlds, but I want to draw your attention to the second half of said riff, where it goes into that cool little melodic bit. I like the contrast between the two different halves of that thrash break riff. In a nutshell, that demonstrates just how interesting Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle songwriting can get. Another very noticeable facet of their sound would be their incorporation of, I guess, what you could call period era music, military marches and such. Now, this isn't that unusual for right-wing black metal bands, but the way that Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle goes about doing said incorporation of found sounds is rather unique. I mean, you have other right-wing black metal bands like Vothana and Absurd that incorporate period era music into their sound. In the case of Absurd, they'll actually cover older German folk songs. In the case of Vothana, he mostly uses these Vietnamese military marches, kind of set the atmosphere at the beginning of a song. Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle does something a little bit different. They kind of make sort of like a weird collage out of everything, where they'll have maybe multiple songs going at the same time, almost like they're trying to drown each other out, like two armies fighting, and then over that they add samples of sounds of two armies fighting. So it maintains that sense of chaos that's endemic to the rest of their music. Also, they don't pull a Nargaroth and have the samples go on for too long. Also, can we talk about the potent groove this band is almost always rocking, particularly during the mid-paced sections? Because that shit definitely fucking crushes, dude. And it really helps offset the fast and brutal sections quite nicely. And again, that sort of compositional dynamic has its roots in the 80s Brazilian stuff as well, with Sepultura songs like Antichrist or Sarcophago songs like Nightmare. But what those songs did not have was something like that bit right there, sort of an incorporation of Rock Against Communism style punkish melody to offset the hyper chaotic riffs, or this weirdly dissonant yet simultaneously melodic sort of tremolo riff. Very bright sounding stuff for what is supposed to be, you know, very dark black metal music. But that's what makes Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle so interesting and addictive to listen to. They've taken all of these like weird old elements, a lot of which were left by the wayside by most of modern black metal, and have re-examined them in an interesting new context. And that's why, for my money, Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle is one of the best currently active black metal bands, and is certainly probably better than whatever you're listening to right now.
I'm ballsy.
But there you go, great modern black metal. Highly recommend Ravendark's Monarchal Canticle. Hopefully you enjoyed learning about them. Even if you didn't, thanks for watching or listening or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
In conclusion, go to hell and suck a dick. Later, dick lickers.